Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Sejam bem-vindas e bem-vindos à Faculdade de Letras da Universidade de Lisboa e às Lisbon Lectures in the Humanities. A conferência está prestes a começar. Agradecemos que ocupem os vossos lugares e coloquem os telemóveis no silêncio. Iniciará esta sessão o Sr. Diretor da Faculdade de Letras, Professor Dr. Miguel Tamen, a quem solicitamos que se dirija ao púlpito.
Boa tarde, very good afternoon to you all. It is our pleasure to actually welcome today our fifth distinguished lecturer in the Lisbon Lectures in the Humanities series, Professor Salikoko Mufwene. This, of course, is this series has become much more than a series, almost a tradition, I suppose, after the fifth installment, you could call it a tradition now. And as usual, we're extremely grateful to the various people and entities that made this event possible. I'd like to thank, first and foremost, my colleague Hernán Espírito Santo and the FLUL, my colleagues Tchek Apmeyer and Hugo Cardoso, our international office, and of course João Dionísio, without whom everything would have been so much harder. So, without further ado, let me call Tchek Apmeyer, who will introduce our speaker. I hope you enjoy yourselves. Thank you very much.
Boa tarde a todos. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce today's invited speaker at the Lisbon Lectures in Humanities, Professor Salikoko Mufwene. Professor Mufwene is a distinguished professor of linguistics at the University of Chicago and a leading specialist in the field of language contact and language evolution. This is not only attested by his extensive publication and presentation track record, which are in several hundreds each, but also by the distinctions he has earned and the many pivotal roles he has fulfilled throughout his career as a consequence of his outstanding scholarship across different disciplinary research areas. To give you just a few examples of these roles, at the University of Chicago, he's a professor on the Committee of Evolutionary Biology, on the Committee of the Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science, and on the Committee of African Studies. He's also a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and for this specific academic year he was appointed to the chair Mondes Francophones at the Collège de France. As Professor Mufwene himself has said in interviews, or at least in one interview, his life journey has played an important role in the shaping of his academic interests. Professor Mufwene was born in colonial Belgian Congo, where he quickly learned to juggle between different languages. His native tongue, Kiansi, or Yansi without the prefix, if you want to, the regional lingua franca Kituba, based primarily on Kikongo, and of course, the colonial language French. It appears that at school, when he was young, he was considered a bit of an enfant terrible, because he would often question the colonial methods. But in hindsight, we can say that these were the early signs of the profound intellectual and critical spirit that characterized his life and work. He started his academic journey more or less at the same time his home country was rebaptized Zaire as a student of philosophy and arts, and then moved on to the University of Chicago, where he obtained his PhD in linguistics in 1979, and more specifically in the domain of semantics. His teaching career started in the Caribbean at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica, where he spent 1 year as a lecturer, and then he would spend the next 10 years at the University of Georgia, where he moved through the ranks to become full professor, before in 1991 returning to his alma mater, the University of Chicago, permanently. During his 1 year period in Jamaica, Professor Mufwene became interested in Creole languages, not only from a linguistic point of view, but also from the perspective of the misconceptions that these languages have been facing throughout history. He started to critically appraise some of the concepts that had been around, such as decreolization
and ultimately also the term Creole itself. But perhaps his main battle was with so-called Creole exceptionalism, the idea that Creoles are linguistically unlike any other natural languages, often with the underlying idea that they are simpler or less than other languages. As of today, unfortunately, there are still a number of scholars out there who put great effort in trying to show that this is indeed the case. But fortunately, they do not preach at this faculty. Instead of Creole exceptionalism, Professor Mufwene strongly embraces the uniformitarian approach to Creole languages and language in general, which is the idea that languages are equally complex systems and have been so in the past and in the present. In particular, he seeks to explain the dynamics and differences of linguistic realities at the intersection of the humanities and biology. In his model, languages are shaped and evolve according to their ecosystem, which takes into account aspects such as population structure, competition and selection of linguistic features, as well as social, historical, political, cultural and economic factors, whose weight varies in time and space. This rather holistic model should then be able to explain why languages are the way they are and, for example, how they relate to each other within the same family, as for instance Portuguese with respect to its ancestors, Vulgar Latin or Classical Latin, or Portuguese with respect to its descendant, Cape Verdean, or Cape Verdean Creole if you want to. The comparative method, of course, leaves no doubt that all these varieties, all these languages belong to the same family. Which is not clear for everybody, but should be. Since the complex cognitive processes that underlie the formation and evolution of languages are the same everywhere and have been the same throughout human history, uniformitarianism again, Professor Mufwene's ecological approach therefore allows to debunk certain misconceived views that some languages are simpler, more primitive, or even inferior compared to others. Ideas that go all the way back to the 19th century racist theories. This type of stigma often affects languages in colonial settings, but in particular Creoles, and even more so if they involve African populations. Within the ecological approach, the evolution that led to the formation of Creole languages as offspring from their lexifier language would not be fundamentally different from the evolution of Latin into Romance languages. What varies are the ecological factors. Professor Mufwene has in fact contributed with some thought-provoking ideas about types of colonization and their different linguistic byproducts. Settlement colonies would lead to new languages, the one we often call Creoles. Exploitation colonies would originate indigenized varieties, and trade colonies would be fertile ground for pidgins. This, of course, brings to the foreground the possibility that so-called Creoles do not develop from pidgins. In fact, Professor Mufwene goes even further by questioning the usefulness of the term Creole itself. And this makes a lot of sense if the languages we call Creoles do not form a typological class, nor a socio-historical class, and most certainly not a language family. Since Creoles are all about restructuring a lexifier language to some degree according to their ecology, one might then be tempted to apply the term Creole to all historically restructured varieties, including Vulgar Latin, or the Romance languages, or English, and in a certain way, probably all languages. But perhaps it would be much simpler to abandon the term Creole, for example, by starting with language names, Jamaican instead of Jamaican Creole, Haitian instead of Haitian Creole, etc. And to stop lumping these languages together in textbooks, separated from other languages as if they were different from other natural languages. From my own experience, it's also not uncommon to hear or read concerned voices claiming about restructured Portuguese varieties spoken in Africa when people say that they are Creolizing. Indeed, the stigma Professor Mufwene has been fighting against in his work is quite omnipresent if we carefully think about this. Much credit is also due to Professor Mufwene for bringing the fundamental concept of the founder principle or founder effect from biology into Creole studies. In his work, he has argued that the founder populations in a contact setting will leave a strong imprint on newly developing varieties, the so-called Creoles. I myself owe a lot to this proposal because it works beautifully in the case of the Gulf of Guinea Creoles. In collaborative work on these languages and populations, together with historians and geneticists, we were able to confirm a solid linguistic and genetic African founder effect related to the Niger Delta languages and peoples. And more so, this founder effect came about during the relatively short homestead period, the so-called Société d'Habitation, to throw in another French word, whose importance Professor Mufwene has often emphasized in his work. On his turn, influenced by Robert Chaudensson, the late Robert Chaudensson. Since colonization and globalization are frequently at the origin of language contact and the loss of linguistic diversity, Professor Mufwene's work also draws the attention to the problem of the many minority languages that are currently endangered or already at the verge of extinction. Over 40% of the world's languages according to UNESCO. And here we are again at the crossroads between linguistics and biology. Darwin was aware that languages have affinities with biological species. They are born, they die, and they can blend together. Schuchart, the father of Creole studies, would add that there are no pure, unmixed languages. Es gibt kein völlig ungemischte Sprache in German. And for Professor Mufwene, ecology rolls the dice. Of course, the issues that I've just touched upon are only the tip of the iceberg of Professor Mufwene's influential scholarship, from which we all hope to learn a great deal during today's lecture. Finally, I would like to congratulate the organizers of the lectures for the excellent choice of invited speaker and for all the arrangements they took care of. And of course, especially thank our guest for accepting the invitation to be here with us today for the lecture, Making Sense of the Ecology of Language and Linguistic Ecosystems. Audience, please join me in welcoming Professor Mufwene.
Well, thank you very much, Thierry, for that wonderful, generous introduction. And I can tell you put a lot of work into it, and I appreciate it very much. I normally don't expect that kind of long introduction, but I'm pleased. Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Miguel Tamen, Dean of the School of Arts and the Humanities, Professor Arnaldo Espirito Santo, President at FLUL, and Dr. Eduarda Camilo, Managing Administrator of the International Office of the School of Arts and the Humanities. And last but not least, I want to thank Juan, Miguel, Donicio for all the work that you put into this. It's taken a lot of correspondence between the two of us for longer than half a year. And so I'm really very grateful to be here. And after this kind of introduction, I don't know whether I'm going to live up to the expectations. But I'll do my very best, and I'm humbled to be here. Ordinarily, I talk about languages, but this time when we were making arrangements, Juan convinced me that I should be more general and show the relevance of all the work I do in linguistics and about languages to other things. So I chose this title. And you have the word ecology and the word ecosystem. They are very central to my discussion and to the work that I have been doing. And we shouldn't confuse them because in the literature that you read, sometimes people use them interchangeably. I don't. So ecology is just like it is used in ecology, habitat, or environment. And ecosystem in reference to a community of interacting organisms in the physical environment. And in this context, you have to treat us humans too as organisms. That's part of the story. And as we are here today, I become part of your ecology, and you are part of my ecology, and we are going to influence each other in the way that we behave. And in that case, we are all part of the same ecosystem. Okay? And you can see it here in this illustration. So the tree generates a lot of elements that we need, including refreshing our air and protecting us against the rays of the sun, direct exposure and so forth. The caterpillar eats the leaves, and then a bird will eat a caterpillar, and the bird secretes the excrements in the soil, and we have microbes that develop that nurture other things, so we are all interacting with each other in this particular case. So environmentalism has become quite fashionable, a current term. It's used as management of resources in an ecosystem. And then when you look at an ecosystem, there is a lot of interdependence among us. Okay? And some of us affect the ecosystem more drastically than others. And I'm afraid to say it's humans that do this. Okay? But we are also affected by other ecological factors, such as climate change. And all of a sudden, you have less water. And think of nature, how this is managed. About a month and a half ago, I was in Southern Africa and was taken to a safari and realized that one of the reasons why there is diversity that is maintained in nature is because animals or organisms residing in these spaces really have a topographical division of labor. That the elephants graze where the giraffe doesn't graze, where antelopes don't graze. However, they can also replace each other because they have different circadian cycles. Like they go to the water resource not at the same time. Or because water is available in a river, they choose different spots to go and feed. So much so that small animals can stay safe from animals that are predators, carnivorous animals and so forth. And they have time to escape or to anticipate danger and so forth. But when you are really together with each other, then it becomes more difficult, such as when the water resource keeps shrinking. You don't want elephants to be drinking water at the same time as antelopes are drinking water, because one of them is going to get too little. So these are the kinds of dynamics that we face in nature. But at the same time, you look at the birds, for instance, they don't need as much water as the elephant. So when water may appear to be scarce for the elephant, there is still enough for birds and things like that. So this is how you have to interpret ecosystems. So, and ecosystems, this is the message I want to drive here. Ecosystem change over time in response to climate change, for instance, or to how the inhabitants manage the resources that they provide. And here, for instance, we'll find humans guilty of overhunting some particular animals that disappear, and when they disappear, we regret that there are some other things that are happening as a consequence of overhunting, okay? And these are the kinds of things that environmentalists remind us of. And things become more complicated in nature precisely because of our behaviors as humans. Humans have affected our natural ecosystems more significantly than other animals. And we should pay attention to environmentalists. And in the case of language, I'm going to try to explain how this happens, because I don't have as much information about zoology or botany, so I better stick closer to what I'm more familiar with and can claim to understand. Not that I understand everything, but can claim to understand. The species sharing a changing ecosystem respond in various ways, including dying. Some species will be so deprived of what they need to thrive that eventually they die. But other species will modify their behaviors. About 3 hours ago, before the lecture, I was watching a segment of 60 Minutes on CBS in the United States. And it was about a monkey island near Puerto Rico. That's on a small island near Puerto Rico. So after one of those diluvial storms, the trees on the island was just raised down. And the monkeys that lived there, rhesus monkeys, they had to adapt their behaviors. For several days, they didn't receive the food that was normally given to them. They went into what had survived in nature to find out what they can eat to stay alive. And there were algae that were also fed on the land, and they tasted them. And so what the experts have noticed is that they discovered that instead of the usual food that they have been eating, there was other food that they could eat, and they tried that. And we make these kinds of adjustments. We humans too modify our diets when nature changes and we cannot have some of the things that we are, some of the food items that we are accustomed to, and we try other things. Or in this case, for humans, we engage in trade and go and fetch these things elsewhere. If you look at the history of humans, agriculture put us in this position where after producing surplus, we develop taste for other things that we don't grow ourselves, that we don't produce ourselves. We engage in long-distance trade. That was not so long ago in the history of mankind, about 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. These are interesting things to learn. Or another form of adaptation is resorting to technology, okay? Like building dams so that we can contain water longer, those kinds of things. Or we migrate to other ecosystems, other territories, which may influence the dynamics of the places where we relocate. And this is the case of colonization. Okay? I don't want to, cause colonial guilt in you, since you are Europeans, most of you. But when Europeans went to the places that they colonized, they modified the lives of the people that they met there, or they modified the lives of people that they took there. But at the same time, they themselves became modified by the new ecosystem. Okay? So in the case of the United States, for instance, some Americans, white Americans, are offended when you call them European Americans. But they have no problem identifying African Americans as African Americans. And I travel with some European students to Europe, and I asked them whether they felt European, and they said no. We are Americans. There you can tell people have developed a different kind of identity. They live in a different ecosystem. In the world of Arnold Crosby, the European ecological imperialism, published in 1986. And he says Europeans left Europe to develop new Europes that would be better than the Europe that they had left behind. I don't know whether it is these are better Europes, but they are different Europes. Europes that have indigenized. They have developed different lifestyles and so forth, and Europeans can tell differences between Americans and Europeans. So these are the kinds of things that we pay attention to. And what is an important, a critical ecological factor here, the fact that human populations come in contact with each other. When you pay attention to it, even at home, because we are raised as individuals and not necessarily as communities. Communities emerge out of our interactions with each other. But what happens in these lives, individuals influence each other. We know we are different from another person, but we make adjustments. And as we continue to make adjustments, we wind up developing similar patterns of behavior, but only in the family resemblance, in the style of family resemblance. Okay? So that's an experiment that I usually engage people in. You shake hands with people, and you find a lot of differences if you pay attention. Like people that are so vigorous in handshake, you think they're going to yank your arm out of your shoulder. And people that are kind of shy, you think that they cannot really hold your hand. and those kinds of things. In the process, we make adjustments. Some people have to loosen, and some people just have to do it a different way. Okay? Or, you know, you teach each other to use a fork and a knife and so forth. Pay attention to how they use these instruments. You find variation. Okay? But when you have a whole segment of your population sharing similar patterns of behavior, and they move to another territory, guess what happens? Well, because you don't know the other territory, you have to learn what it takes to survive in the new territory, which we call colony. Okay? While the colonized people are making adjustments to you too, and so forth. In the process, you produce a new population structure and a new community, and new manners emerge that sometimes we call syncretic. Sometimes they are just innovations prompted by the new host territory. And these are the kinds of things that we pay attention to. But before I go all that, when it comes to language, we have to remember one thing. That the languages that we speak are the outcomes of the domestication of the anatomy by the mind. And the mind decided what particular body parts were better suited for communication. Did I say just for communication? I shouldn't have said that. For explicit communication. Because communication has always been there in nature. It's part of the ecosystem. Animals, non-human animals communicate. Okay? And if you pay attention to your pet, sometimes your pet goes through frustrations of not being understood when they are communicating something to you. And we claim to be smarter than them and cannot really decode what they are telling us. But if at some point we were like that, we evolved in such a way that we generated communities that needed explicit communication for us to survive. And the mind either co-opted our masticatory organs and breathing apparatus, and through the domestication produced what we call speech. And through speech we develop spoken languages. But if this failed, then the mind domesticated the hand. Okay? If you really pay attention, you should wonder, why didn't we domesticate our legs to communicate? Okay? We would have to be different human beings in order to use hands and our feet and legs to communicate. Real acrobats, if we kept the same kind of anatomy, that doesn't really work. But there are other things that I don't need to get into here. But the point of this is that whatever other ecological factors bear on how we reshape our languages or the languages that we learn from other people, they are filtered through our minds, they are filtered through our anatomies. The kinds of things that we can do are the kinds of things that we cannot do, and so forth. So, like other animals, we are embedded in population structures in which we learn from each other and cooperate more than we fight with each other. Okay, we speak of wars and so forth. These are just the kind of things that break the routine. In the vast majority of cases, we prefer to cooperate because we depend on that cooperation in order to survive, where we complement each other in our skills and all sorts of things. So how we manage, so we generate population structures and these population structures generate specific socioeconomic systems, our ecosystems in which our languages are embedded. So if you understand the socioeconomic structure, then you can understand a whole lot about our language practices. For some of us, at home you speak one language, at the workplace you speak a different language. That's the world I came from. Spoke Chiansi at home, Kikongo Kituba in the street, in playing with people speaking, children speaking other ethnic languages. This was our lingua franca. And then when you become an adult and you do a blue-collar job, you stick to the lingua franca. But if you attended school and wound up having a white-collar job, then you had to learn a European language. French, English, Portuguese, depending on what country you live in and what is the colonial history. But here in Europe, there are people that fall in that category, but there are also other people that do this in terms of sociolex. Okay, so you speak probably a non-standard variety at home, and you speak or use an educated variety, some people call it standard variety, at your job, as you did in school, and in other settings. One way of telling a foreigner that has learned the European language well is by how bookish they sound. Because native speakers go into a colloquial variety. So very often you come across these foreign speakers that are so fluent that they are like people that go to all social affairs in a tuxedo. Of course. Okay. So how we manage our ecosystems or adapt to them when we are controlled by other groups, especially when there are intergroup contacts, affects the vitality of our languages. And one of the things that I want to come back to in terms of colonization is some forms of colonization have been culturally assimilationist and have driven indigenous languages to extinction. But there are some other forms of colonization, which are called exploitation colonization, such as in Africa and Asia, that have had no bearing on indigenous languages. If anything, now in the post-colonial period, in some urban centers, you would say that the indigenous lingua francas are endangering the vitality of the European languages that are called official languages. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to try to understand. Different population structures, depending on whether they are segregated or not segregated, depending on whether they are assimilationists or non-assimilationists, have different effects on the vitality of languages. But we have to remember something. This is a message for people that are really engaged in language endangerment loss as a research area, that languages are technologies that we humans invented to solve our own existential problem, that languages are at the service of humans. And it can be misguided to discuss language endangerment in terms of humans neglecting languages and not serving the languages well, as like reversing the roles. Okay? And you think of languages as technologies, then you have to pay attention to other technologies that we use too. And whether we always stick to our native technologies or consider other foreign technologies as probably being more adapted to our ecosystems that are changing. Okay. My interest in the ecology of language started from an evolutionary linguistics perspective on how Creoles emerged. And Creoles have been treated as outcomes of language contact in specific population structures generated especially by the plantation economy in the colonies. But the question is whether we've been asking the question the right way. This is an issue. Are Creole languages the only languages that are the outcome of language contact? Are there any languages in the world that are not the outcomes of language contact? Okay. So some people approach the emergence of Creoles as something that must be dealt with in a different way. And I'm going to preach for uniformitarianism. And I say Creoles are prompting us to reopening the books on how we have practiced, especially genetic or genealogical linguistics, talking about language speciation. Okay. Can you have a language speciate just out of context. And when you follow the history of mankind the way I would like to write it, since we came out of Africa, and some of us went back to Africa, or some of us just moved within Africa, you will find that our histories consist of layers of mutual colonization. All you have to do is look at the Roman Empire, for instance, or at the Hellenic Empire, and then you compare them, and then you say, I must subscribe to differential evolution, and those kinds of things. So, and the reason why we also think that Creoles are so exceptional in the way they emerge is that we believe that there is a kind of common grammatical template that Creoles share. When I started studying Creoles about 30 years ago, I believed that too. But the more I learned about every Creole, the more I realized that this was the wrong way to approach them. And even if you take, say, Creoles lexified by Portuguese, you're going to find differences between the Creole spoken in Cape Verde and the Creole spoken in the Bayo Biafra, or Bight of Benin, it's the same thing, and the Creole spoken in South Asia and Southeast Asia, to the point that those of Southeast Asia, I even wonder, why do they call them Creoles? I will come back to that if time permits. Okay. Have non-Creole colonial varieties of European languages not evolved in a similar way? Otherwise, why is American English different from British English? Why is Australian English different from British English and from American English? And why should we focus just on the English of India and say that English is indigenized? Why don't we say American English is indigenized? And those kinds of questions. So the answer to the first question, if Creoles all have identical grammatical system, I think you know what my position is negative. And whether or not non-Creole colonial varieties of European languages didn't evolve in ways similar to Creoles, if you deny that, how are you going to account for Amish English in the United States? These are Austrian English, German-speaking populations that shifted languages. And why would you call African-American English a semi-Creole when you could also call Amish English a semi-Creole? Wait a minute. If you take the population, the white population of the United States, the portion that is of English descent, to the extent that you can trace it, is about 20% of the white population. What do you do with the other 80% of the white population? They just learn English perfectly? You know? So these are the kinds of things that we have to take into account. Can we simply think of all the above cases as cases of differential evolution? In the same ways that we can determine that Creoles lexified by English, Creole lexified by English have different features depending on whether the Creole is spoken in the United States, the Creole are spoken in the Caribbean, or the Creole is spoken on the west coast of Africa, or the Creole is spoken in Australia. Okay? And you find similar conclusions too about why American English is not like Australian English and it's not like South African English and so forth. And then you have to question yourself, why do we like the term Creole so much? Okay. I think, well, as a research area, I tell you, it has helped me build a career because I can ask questions that are informative for me, that help me understand language evolution. But if you take the history of the term Creole in the literature, then you also must factor in the kind of colonial context in which the relevant categorization was imposed. So you cannot just say, okay, the term is fashionable and not really question it. Creoles are also outcomes of language shift, adaptation to changing ecosystems. So when I speak of Creoles, I say they are like new Romance languages when the relevant Romance language underwent a Pyrrhic victory. So the language that prevails is affected by the languages that are displaced. That is really how it goes. And then if you go farther back, you say, well, that's the story of the Romance languages themselves. Latin was spread into the provinces of the Roman Empire, and where Latin was adopted as a vernacular, gradually it would displace the Celtic languages that preceded there, or some non-Celtic languages like Basque. But in the process, Latin just underwent a Pyrrhic victory. It's a different breed of language now. It's no longer the kind of italic language that Latin was. Okay. And as we put things in perspective, we want to think, bear in mind, I'm treating languages here as technology. And bear in mind that there were also contacts of different technologies. And the outcomes of contacts have produced new healthcare system. The contact of Iberia or Europe with the Arabs had an important role to play in the evolution of new healthcare practices in Iberia, like indoor toilets, like indoor baths, and things like that. Or then where did the Arabs get these things from? Of course, the Arabs had already been trading with Asia before coming to Europe. And they learned a lot of things from Asia and so forth. We keep borrowing from each other, and this is how we have managed to survive when ecosystems change. Okay? We dress differently, and we practice different religions. I think the Catholic religion is one of the most invasive religions in the world, displacing a lot of indigenous religious practices. And we don't complain about these things. And we complain about languages when people give us their languages when they think it's the best way to adapt to the changing ecosystems. There's a buying power of the language to bring enough bread to your dinner table. Okay? So, and non-Europeans are not the only ones to have experienced technology shift. I hate it when the literature speaks of indigenous people, because the term indigenous people, in the way it is used in the literature now, just means colonized people. And that's not the traditional way, the traditional meaning of indigenous as native to a particular territory. Okay? And you put the history of mankind in perspective, these kinds of changes occurred even long before the European imperial colonial expansion over the last half millennium. You can ask the same questions about that time that we are asking now. You know, how did England become an Anglophone country? Or how did the British Isles become an Anglophone country? Okay. In the same way as how did Southwestern Europe become a set of Romance countries. They could have been speaking different kinds of languages. And the same people that from the point of view of how we are discussing language endangerment and loss today would be considered victims are the people that participated in the colonization of the world outside Europe over the past half millennium, and they have benefited quite big from the colonization. Okay. So one afternoon in my office, didn't feel like working very hard, and just thought that I would sketch a map of where Pidgins emerged and where Creoles emerged around the world. And I came up with this map, and I was struck by the complementary distribution between where Pidgins emerge and where Creoles emerge, and you can correlate them with different styles of colonization, and I'm going to come back to that. And the only place that looks different is Hawaii. Sorry, Hawaii is here, not there. Hawaii. But you look carefully at Hawaii, Creole in Hawaii developed in the city and not on the plantation. And Pidgin developed on the plantation and not in the city. And things get actually a little bit more complicated because the labor in Hawaii consisted of indentured servants. Well, that's really not the term I wanted to use. Okay. Well, now the term has slipped. Anyway, but the people that came to Hawaii, the laborers that came, the engagés, okay, they brought their families with them. They lived in family units. There wasn't much interethnic mixing. The contract laborer is the term I was looking for. That's the contract laborers, they live in ethnic groups in Hawaii. They were not mixed like in the plantations of the Indian Ocean, in the plantations of the Atlantic. This is a different phenomenon. In other words, they could survive in the new ecosystem without learning the European language, the master's language. There were foremen who acted as interpreters between the plantation owner and the contract laborers. And Pidgin developed there precisely because you get something close to the classic definition of a Pidgin, a language that emerges in settings of sporadic contacts, where the people that are learning the new language don't have regular exposure to it, and nobody took classes to do that. Whereas Creole develop in other settings, and I'm going to come back to that later, but this is quite interesting. And the contract laborers in Hawaii and the plantation started in the 19th century, not in the 17th century. So way after the abolition of slavery. And if you put it in the context of the American economy, it's after the Americans had bought Louisiana through the Louisiana Purchase and killed the plantation system that the French had set in place, sugar plantation systems, and now wanted to develop different sources for sugar, and so Hawaii was the right place for that kind of thing. So you put this, you can see that we keep adapting ourselves to the ecosystem that we change. And here, just something that I already talked about, that we have these movements out of Africa, back into Africa, and they all, not all of them, but many of them involve layers of colonization replacing each other, and that is particularly important. In other words, contact as a factor in the emergence of Creoles is not peculiar to Creoles. That only reflects our ignorance of our history. Contact has been part of our migrations around the world. Okay. So we get the Indo-European dispersal, first within Europe, and then South Asia, and then East, well, part of Asia there. And since the last half millennium, as the European languages have become the dominant vernaculars in the Americas and Australia. That's significant. But that's not the last phase of the Indo-European expansion. I'm going to come back to that later. You find it in Brazil, in the rainforest. Okay. And here, about my own people, the Bantu in Africa, about 3,000 years ago, we too started migrating into parts of Africa that where Pygmies had been indigenous, and the Khoi and San people had been indigenous, and so forth. And by now, we have displaced all the Pygmy languages. We have displaced most of the Khoi and San languages. But speaking of Pyrrhic victory, the outcome is the multitude of Bantu languages spoken in the region. And you find evidence for this, particularly in Southern Africa, where you get Bantu languages that have cliques, which have been borrowed from the Khoi and San languages. Okay? And if you want to understand the diversification of Indo-European languages, it would be something that reflects what we observe now in the later stages of colonization. Contacts shape the languages locally, and depending on what languages the Indo-Europeans, what particular languages were spoken by the people that the Indo-Europeans came in contact with or colonized, you get a different Indo-European language. And as you put things in perspective, you realize that the Romance languages are not older than 2,000 years. You know, I'm being generous here in time. And how many layers did it take for the Indo-European languages to emerge and so forth? So the time depth, you don't quite get it in the traditional scholarship in genealogical linguistics. And Creoles are telling us, you better pay attention to periodization in the history of mankind. You're going to learn many more things about those languages. You find the same thing in China. About 5,000 years ago, the Semitic population started dispersing. Okay, and I was at a meeting, I think, Hugo, you were this a workshop in Hong Kong via Zoom, where I asked a sinologist, can we explain the multitude of Semitic languages, you know, in terms of contact with non-Semitic languages? And he paused and said, of course. You know, that's the trend. And now, people that have been colonized are coming to Europe with vengeance, including myself. And Europeans are talking of super diversity. Well, I say, well, then I should be speaking of super diversity in Africa thanks to European colonization, because they caused migration that brought people from different places also into Africa, not just Europeans, like some of the contract laborers that the British brought to East Africa and South Africa in the 19th century. So these are things that we have to pay attention. So there is a whole lot in what has happened in recent history that we can explain in terms of ecosystem, changes in ecosystems, the influence of contact, that should help us better explain the histories of languages in our in our history. Okay, but also as we look at the dispersal of the Indo-Europeans, let's call it the second wave of the dispersal of Indo-Europeans in the last half millennium, then you realize we cannot just keep talking about colonization too court. We have to make distinction. The Americas were not colonized in the same way as Africa was colonized. And even when we speak of independence, the term independence takes a different kind of meaning when you are talking about the Americas, where white Americans were rebelling against the control of the motherland in Europe, and they didn't want to be part of it anymore, and they wanted to be a separate kind of entity, and didn't want to share that freedom with the Native Americans, didn't want to share that freedom with the Africans that they had brought to the places and so forth, versus Africa that was colonized, especially in the 19th century, for the production of raw materials that were going to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And when the Africans became independent, you watch it, they became politically independent, but not economically independent, and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that we have to understand. And that's why, as I said earlier, in the Americas, because of the way that the colonies were developed, indigenous languages can't survive no more than the languages spoken by Europeans that were not the primary colonizers survive. So German has not survived in the United States, Italian has not survived in the United States, and you keep going, and Norwegian has not survived, and so forth. And so what Native Americans are doing is not exceptional. And if we want to make better sense of how language endangerment is occurring and what is driving language endangerment, we have to understand why the Germans have become Anglophone in North America, why the French are seeing their language displaced, except in Quebec, where the French learn how to fight back by empowering the language economically, and they are successful. Louisiana is trying to do it ideologically by just claiming, Francophonie and so forth, but nothing is happening. The French is buying time, it will go away. And these are the kinds of things that we have to pay attention to. So once we make distinction between different styles of colonization, there are certain things that we are going to understand a whole lot better. And we are going to be able to explain from my point of view, and I'm an iconoclast, the kinds of things that we can explain better by really putting things in historical perspective and see to what extent history actually repeats itself. Okay, not exactly in the same ways because the settings are not identical. Okay. And so you take the Roman Empire, for instance, you have to treat the empires as colonies, outcomes of colonial expansion. And those colonies were called provinces in the history of Rome. And what you see, first of all, there were two kinds of Latin spreading: classical Latin and Vulgar Latin. And Vulgar Latin went with the economy. Classical Latin went with elite culture and so forth, and classical Latin didn't survive. It's Vulgar Latin that survived, but that's where you also see that Pyrrhic victory of Latin. It displaced indigenous languages, but it was modified by those indigenous languages. So, unfortunately, as somebody pointed out to me, we don't really know much about the Celtic languages that were spoken at that time. But if we can show that in the case of Creoles, the languages spoken previously by the people that produced Creoles, we call them substrate languages, influence the prevailing language, this should be the default assumption. Instead of saying it was just Latin changing, and you don't want to recognize anything about the influence, the role of the people that were appropriating Latin as a new language. Okay? And come to think of it, historical linguistics or genetic linguistics developed in the 19th century too. So it carries all the biases, social biases that come along with this. It's like Europeans are really perfect learners of other languages. Come to Africa and listen to us as we mock Europeans that speak African languages poorly. Okay. So, and then another question. Why did the Romance languages develop only in the Western Empire? What is left of the Western Empire, not in the Eastern Empire? And yet the Eastern Empire lasted 1,000 years longer. We have to come up with answers, okay? And why didn't England become a Romance country? Because the Romans walked out of England and out of Western, the southwestern Europe about the same time. Okay? And then later on, I'm going to talk about Iberia. I want to provoke you. And what happened in this particular case in Iberia, in the 5th century, the Roman Empire collapsed. About 2 centuries later, the Visigoths colonized Iberia, but the Visigoths were illiterate. The Visigoths didn't have the same kind of administrative sophistication that the Romans had, and so it was a setback in the history of Iberia. So a regression. In the meantime, you wonder if Latin was spreading at all in Iberia. Or was it just a small class of people like the missionaries and the intellectual elite, and there wasn't much of that in Iberia at that time? So what happened? You want to ask, how did Latin survive? Could Latin have been reintroduced? But things become more complicated because in the 7th century, here come the Arabs, or Muslims as Moors, as the literature characterizes them. And they have more sophistication economically, okay, like they brought the irrigation system to the land, and they had a better administration, and Arabic was functioning as the language of the scholarship too, not necessarily just as an administrative language. So you have to think of this period as similar, this is the way I see it, to the colonization of Africa. You have the colonized language that is brought to you, and you know that in order to succeed in the highest spheres of the colonial rule, you have to learn the colonizer's language. And Latin just was forgotten. Not completely, people wanted it, but you wonder what proportion of the Iberian population spoke any form of Latin or Neo-Latin during that time. The literature that I used to read would say, the Romans brought Latin, and then since then Latin has been evolving and becoming more and more different. But why was it becoming more and more different? This gives you an opportunity to think about how much influence of Arabic there is in Castilian, for instance. Okay, and the Arabs did this for 7 centuries, although what we notice is a contraction of Andalusia during that time, about the 12th century or 11th century. People started fighting back, led by Castile and Aragon, and pushing the Arabs further south. But Arabic still remains an important language of scholarship. It's through Arabic that the classics were brought back to Spain, or to Iberia in general, because Spain didn't exist yet. In my heresies, I say Spain was born at the same time as the colonies of Spain in the Americas. It's a matter of term. But otherwise, there was not no Spain yet. And that's an important part of this puzzle, the Jews that were in Iberia, most of whom had also come from North Africa, and they spoke Arabic or read Arabic very well, and they could work in the administration. And they were the kind of go-betweens between the indigenous Iberians and the colonizers, the Arabs and the Moors. And there were different styles of administration. If you wanted to work in the colonial administration, you had to learn Arabic. But otherwise, you didn't have to, and that makes the situation also more similar to Africa, where the European languages, as long as they have been taught in school and in schools and so forth, are spoken on average by at best 30% of the population. There are some exceptions, such as Gabon, but that is what you find in Africa. And the rest of Africa wouldn't change much if people stop speaking French or stop speaking English and those kinds of things. But when you pay attention, this is precisely what happens in Iberia, because by the 15th century, this is what is left of Andalusia, where Arabic is spoken. But in the meantime, the kingdom of Castile and Aragon, that had become bigger, had been promoting Castilian. Why do they call it Castilian? Or is this an indigenized variety of Latin? In the same way that we speak of le français d'Afrique, because of African influence on French, or indigenized Englishes in India, Ghana, and so forth, because of the influence of indigenous languages there. And when they wanted to reintroduce, the Castilians wanted to reintroduce Castilian or whatever in the school system, did they also reintroduce Latin through teachers brought from elsewhere? This happened in the history of French. I know that too. So what we are learning here is that we have to stop thinking of the history of languages in a unilinear way and in a continuous way, because there may have been moments of discontinuity and so forth. I bring this up because when we discuss the divergence of structures of Creoles from those of the lexifiers, we bring in demographics. Non-Europeans were the majority. Segregation was in place. There were no regular contacts with speakers of the lexifiers. Isn't this the same thing with Latin? And what is interesting here, after the Western Empire had collapsed, how much contact was there between Iberia and Rome, other than through the Pope? Okay? And missionaries were in an ambivalent situation, because for the purpose of proselytizing, they preferred using indigenous languages, but also the state relied on them to have organized the school system and to introduce Latin in the school system and so forth. So you have some sort of artificial Latin. Didn't I speak of us non-native speakers speaking European language in a bookish way? That's part of the change that occurs in all this. But these are all forms of adaptations to changing ecosystems. You can find similarities for this when you deal with zoology, for instance, or even with botany. Think of plants that the Portuguese played a very important role in transporting from one part of the world to another part of the world. We owe the spread of the coconut or cocoa to cocoa palm tree to the Portuguese, or the spread of pepper around the world and so forth. Okay, so we pay attention to these things. So geography, how much time do I have left? I don't see any clock. Okay, I have to move faster. In Iberia, the language repertoire didn't change in Andalusia, but Castilian emerged as a significant Romance alternative to classical Arabic outside Andalusia. And in the 13th century, King Alfonso X, called the Wise or the Learned, promotes Castilian as the language of the state and has a code of laws written in Castilian rather than classical Arabic. What this history doesn't tell us was how much translation the average Iberian needed in order to understand the new code of laws. It reminds me of Africa too, where you go to court, you speak an indigenous language and the court records it, translates it in French, and you have no chance of checking if the recording is accurate. Okay. So, but the erosion of the status of Arabic in Christian Iberia occurred, and even though classical Arabic remained a prestigious language for scholarship until the 15th century. Okay. And by 1492, something close to Spain as a nation arises, especially after the marriage of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, and Granada is reconquered, and Castilian becomes the language of the state for the whole territory. But now you are also dealing with Catalan seeking its own autonomy as an alternative to Spanish or Castilian in Catalonia. Okay, so these are interesting things that we have to learn. And you wonder why, how did Catalan become so powerful? Well, I understand Catalonia is economically very powerful, and the language of the economy has a chance to survive. And this is about what is happening around the world. The language of the economy is the one that prevails. And in Africa, this hasn't happened because the colonial economy was developed for the purposes of developing Europe. And Europeans believe in talking to Africans in indigenous languages or using colonial auxiliaries in developing that blue-collar sector of the economy. And the white-collar sector has not been very productive and not very inclusive, and a lot of people don't care very much about European languages in Africa. Okay, so then we can understand why things are evolving differentially regarding language evolution. Okay, different colonization styles generated different population structures, and differences in evolutionary outcomes can be correlated with those differences. So in the 15th century, when the Portuguese were the only ones trading in Africa and Asia on the coast, the relationships, first the trade was not like any European can get their boat and sail past the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. That wouldn't be possible because the ship would be too small and subject to wrecks, the boat. people had to wait for the invention of the caravel ship and so forth. And you read that the history of that trade, it was fleets of ships, like 20 ships in a fleet going for the trade. And the trade was between mercantile companies, except I think in Portugal because it was the business of Henry the Navigator and his successors. And they traded with indigenous rulers. Indigenous rulers had the protocol of this, doing business with outsiders through interpreters. So we are dealing here with people that were important brokers, a question that we haven't addressed much in the study of Creoles is how the interpreters emerged. Okay? I'm going to give you some clues in a while. And in this case, European languages didn't have a chance of spreading in Africa because most Africans didn't interact with Europeans. And the interpreters kept these languages as particular privileges for making money and, rising their importance in around the forts, okay, and their status relative to the rulers and like. So, trade proceeded in European languages, but not only in European languages, because when you factor in sailing conditions and so forth, Europeans had to stay on the coast, idling sometimes for 6 months, and they formed unions with local women, and they raised bilingual children. And the Europeans on the coast that were waiting learned a little bit of African languages. The relationships were more egalitarian. We have to wait until the 19th century before Europeans have the upper hand on on indigenous rulers and take their lands away from them and colonize Africa in a different style. Okay, the settlement colonies, we have to make a distinction between two kinds. Settlement colonies where Europeans became the majority population, and that's where we speak of new dialects of European languages, versus settlement colonies when non-indigenous people and non-Europeans became the majority population owing to the slave trade, and that is where the varieties we call Creoles emerge. But if you put those plantation colonies comparatively, you compare them with the history of the Romance languages, you find similarities. That Latin evolved into the Romance languages in territories where the native speakers were a tiny and negligible minority, and especially after they left. That's when, because of trade being practiced in Latin, Vulgar Latin, and a part of the economy developing in Vulgar Latin, and because Vulgar Latin would become the vernacular of the emergent urban centers, then you see this kind of gradual development. And if we really could visit that literature, the archives closely, we would find the same formula that Robert Chodanson had proposed for Creoles, approximations of approximations of approximations. And we witnessed this in Africa with European languages spoken by the elite. The approximation of approximation produces what we call indigenous Englishes of Français d'Afrique. I don't know whether you use a similar term for Portuguese in former Portuguese colonies, but these are things that we have to remember. And the exploitation colonies of Africa, I explained this already, there was a lot of segregation, where the natives didn't really interact regularly with the colonizers, and when the colonizers interacted with the natives, it was through interpreters too. I realized that about 5 years ago that Africa too was colonized through interpreters. It's not just the slave trade that proceeded through interpreters. The exploitation, colonization of Africa proceeded through interpreters, through brokers, and those are the colonial auxiliaries, the people, part of the elite that would step in the shoes of the colonizers after Africa became independent. And then isolation from the metropole made it possible for the European languages to Africanize or indigenize more and diverge structurally away from the European models. This is, I published a paper in 2009 where I said, well, all these new varieties of English are indigenized Englishes because they have adapted to the new ecosystems, human ecosystems, but natural ecosystems and so forth. And you have places that had two styles of colonization mixed. One of them is Zimbabwe. You have the exploitation, colonization of Zimbabwe, but then you also have a group of settlers to whom the principle of colonization didn't apply. And when Zimbabwe became independent, for those of you that are old enough to know, the settlers wanted to stay while the British were leaving. And the settlers, they had all this land that they had taken away from the natives, and they were very much invested in that, and they wanted also to participate in the new government because they didn't consider themselves British anymore, and so forth. You find a similar thing in South Africa, where the British actually colonized the Afrikaners, then the Boers. And then in 1948, they finally passed over the power to the Afrikaners, and then we are talking about apartheid. Okay? And in all this, where are the natives? And now we speak of South African English. You have to factor in all these factors in order to understand the history. Colonization generated new population structures. Trade colonies produced world concessions called trade force and didn't produce pigeons, at least not immediately. And that too, the narrative has to change. Settlement colonization associated with dispossession of land from native populations, and then the native populations were expected to assimilate to European population, to European systems, but only quite tardively, because first the natives were marginalized. Okay, and it's not by accident that we now worry about the endangerment of Native American languages. It's at the time where they can assimilate in the same way that non-English Europeans were assimilating to the Anglo culture and becoming Anglophones, and Native Americans too are going to become Anglophone and so forth, and you understand the dynamics and you can understand how this is happening. By the way, this is not the first time Native American languages were endangered, because early on in the 17th century, there were all these germs brought from the old world that were killing Native Americans and were certainly endangering Native American languages. And because of all the cases of smallpox and so forth, Native Americans were running away from Europeans and mixing among themselves, and that the mixing had an impact too on the vitality of indigenous languages, and these are the kinds of things that we should bring into the discourse. And I'm going to slip part of that. And in the case of exploitation, colonization of Africa, so I explain why the indigenization started, and my hypothesis is that indigenization started after independence, because the small class of colonial auxiliaries that interacted with Europeans, they had plenty of opportunities to learn the European languages well. and those of them that have lived long enough are the ones telling the younger generation that they are not competent enough in the European language. So, this is important because I'm going to come up with a question for especially Hugo later on. I don't have to deal with this anymore. But when you look at the map of Africa here and all the dots, these are all places where the Portuguese had trade colonies. And you would expect some trace of a pigeon there. And you don't find any. And the literature speaks of Africans learning Portuguese well enough to communicate with the Portuguese and be helpful in the trade. There is a good reason. There were fortifications. The brokers lived closely with the the representatives of the European mercantile companies. And then they learned the language well enough. African rulers sometimes dispatched members of their entourage to Portugal or other places in Europe later on to learn the European language in Europe and then come and function as go-betweens, trade brokers. So this is particularly important. But the children that were born in these forts, they were bilinguals, okay? So we have to make sense of this, and you find a similar cluster of Portuguese colonies, essentially coastal, okay? But here we see the varieties that linguists call Creoles. You wonder what's the difference. We want to explain that. So there was quite a bit of acculturation and syncretic evolutions on the coast. There are these women, business women, that had already been trading with the Arabs when the Europeans arrived. You know, they were prepared to trade with Europeans. And I told you of idling times, 6 months or so, waiting for the wind to facilitate sailing back to Europe, or would recommend wiser to stay at the in the fort, waiting for the weather conditions to change, and especially the direction of the winds to change. In the meantime, they produced women, but there was a kind of Europeanization of these women too, and the women are called señor, señorita, and so forth. And these are the women that really ran the business. And we have to recognize that. And so after the Portuguese colonies in along the coast of Africa were confiscated by the French, by the Dutch, by the English, dynamics changed. Eventually, these people didn't need Portuguese anymore. And I think that the kind of assimilation that took place here culturally is not the kind of assimilation that took place in Asia. And I'm speculating on this, so the experts can correct me. But this is again to show to what extent that acculturation was taking place. But you go to Asia, you find settlements that are also walled cities, so to speak, where not just anybody in Asia form special relations with the Portuguese. You don't have as much linguistic diversity inside the forts. So multilingualism is not as extensive as in other cases where Creoles emerge. And living closely with the Portuguese, the people, the indigenous people, learned to speak Portuguese. And this is not the only thing they did. They also Christianized. And they really adopted Portuguese culture, so much so that some of them still are claiming Portuguese citizenship and can travel with Portuguese passports around the world. So this is a different kind of thing that didn't happen in Africa, okay? And when I put things in perspective, I say, isn't this like the history of Latin in southwestern Europe? Okay, why am I bringing this? Because the Portuguese colonies will be confiscated too by the English, by the French, by the Dutch. The English capitalized on India, the French capitalized in Indochina, but lost it, and the Dutch capitalized on Indonesia. 3 giant pieces of land. And in the meantime, you have I'm going to skip all this. You have people called Christian, who practice this new cultural heritage of theirs. Okay? And what strikes me is that the non-linguistic heritage seems to have survived better than the linguistic heritage. Why? Because after the Portuguese lost the colonies, my speculation, I emphasize speculation, is that the input from native Portuguese was cut off. The people, as a privileged group, had to reposition themselves relative to the new rulers and relative to the other indigenous populations. And I suspect that is when substrate influence started kicking in. And what we also find here, because of what Victor Singler called homogeneity of the substrate, there is a greater chance of exerting influence on the language in the direction of divergence. It's the same thing that we find in Melanesian pidgins, where the substrate languages are very similar to each other, and you find in substrate Melanesian pidgins features that you don't find in other pidgins in West Africa, and things like that. And there you find the same populations in this, does it remind you of anything traditional in Portugal? You have to factor that in. And you have the burghers, about which I learned from reading publications of Hugo, and that's also where I found out that these people have a particular attachment to Portugal that they want to preserve, and that goes all the way to language. But they have become a minority in a place where English has become a very important language, where Hindi is making ground into that. And so a whole lot of it remains ritual, and this is where you notice language attrition. But in this case, I suspect it's not just language attrition, it's more room for substrate influence from the other languages that people have to speak, because they are in contact with other people speaking major indigenous languages. Okay, so settlement colonization reminds us of how English was born. I'll just give that part of the history. That in the 5th century, when the Germanic populations colonized England, there was no language called English. And then by the 7th century, there is this language that retrospectively we call Old English. And you pay attention the way the Jutes, the Saxons, the Angles, why is the country called England? In Old English it's England. The land is a lot of arrogance, you know. You call the country after the immigrants. Okay? So it looks like there was competition among the different Germanic languages that were brought to England, and the language of the Angles prevailed. And English is the way of speaking of the Angles. And then you have to get into details. In other words, just like some European languages also died in the colonies, something similar happened to in England, and that is worth bearing in mind. So you can compare that to what happened with the Indo-Europeans dispersing. Don't take this map too seriously. It's being questioned by geneticists because genes have not migrated in the way shown here. But in any case, that dispersal, if you believe in the notion of proto-language, I don't, but if you believe in it, you have to explain why that language diversified into so many different languages. You must factor in the substrate languages. The same thing is the case for the Bantu languages. If you believe in Proto-Bantu, you have to come up with an explanation. But whether you believe it or not, the number of languages in the areas of expansion has increased and differentiated. And the same thing here with Chinese, okay? So some critical ecological factors are near the end. Population size and population structure matter. Periodization and patterns of population growth and the founder principle or effect, they matter. And mode of language transmission. Do you transmit the language through school, which is an artificial way, our case in Africa? Or do you transmit the language just by naturalistic language learning, by interacting with people? Like I asked, how do you say good morning in Portuguese, and how do you say thank you, and how do you say bye-bye? Then little by little I can ask, how are you, and so forth, and I keep learning the language gradually depending on my level of immersion. Okay, so we have to look into the feature pool, how different are the features of the different languages in contact, or whether the differences are extensive or the differences are not that extensive. In the case of Portuguese in South Asia, the differences are extensive, so you find signs of agglutination in the Portuguese of South Asia that you don't find in the Portuguese of the Bight of Benin, and this is particularly important. And then you have Cape Verde that is so close to Portugal, and it's Cape Verdean Creole, I heard, is the closest to Portuguese among the different Portuguese Creoles. And you want to look into language function, and in the case of Creoles, they have always functioned as vernaculars, not as lingua francas. Okay, and whether language shift is involved or not. In the case of Pidgins, no language shift occurred. Now, when you go to Melanesia, you want to question this. And in linguistics, in Creolistics, we'd be debating whether these expanded Pidgins, as we call them, are really Creoles or Pidgins. Okay? But one thing I found out in my iconoclastic approach is that Pidgins are actually telling us what Chaudanson has been telling us in the position that I adopted. They have evolved by approximations of approximations of approximations. There was never, according to me, a time of an incipient Pidgin that was a broken language and then became a normal language and so forth. It has always been a normal language spoken by a smaller group of people. But as there were more and more speakers, and as the model speakers were more and more non-native, the language became more and more different. The same thing that you're going to find for indigenized languages or for Français d'Afrique and so forth. And I think It's also the same thing that you find about Australian English, American English, and so forth. The more autonomous the territories become from the metropole, the more latitude they have for digression, especially when you bring in contacts with other languages, as happened in Iberia, that can explain to what extent and how new Latin varieties, Neo-Latin varieties in Iberia differ from Neo-Latin varieties in Formegal and so forth. So there are more borrowings, I think, from Arabic in Spanish, and I suspect Portuguese too, than there are in French or Italian, because of the 7 centuries of contact that existed between Arabic and the languages spoken in Spain, and especially Neo-Latin as it was expanding gradually, but also interrupted in Iberia. So here we come again to that question of, if languages are technologies, just like religion and so forth, why do we worry so much about people giving up their languages for a language that is going to help them survive in a changing in a changing ecosystem, especially if the language of the economy that helps you survive is not your indigenous language, and if your indigenous language is not empowered economically, don't we find similar things in other aspects of technologies? And I think I can stop here. I see I have spoken way too long. So this is how the ecology rolls the dice on language evolution within specific socioeconomic structures, as ecosystems, as I would call them. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Will you take any questions still? Do you think we still have time?
I'm yours, so it's. Don't be too shy.
Thank you very much for that fantastic talk. I was kind of wanted to get up multiple times and say thank you, yes, yes. So I agree with everything you said, and I think it's very important. I have 2 short questions that I think are a bit connected. One is we have all the talk about mixed languages, which I think was coined by Martin Maus, and in Southern Africa in the Khoisan studies we like to speak about substrate interference. So in your approach, all of these should basically be lumped with the Creole studies, because they would be seen as differential language or differential outcomes of language evolution in similar settings, right?
Yeah. So the question is about mixed languages?
Yeah, mixed languages and what is sometimes termed substrate interference in some languages where people don't want to speak about creolization, like in some Khoisan languages of Southern Africa, where it's clear that they sort of have mixed.
Yeah. Well, the question is whether there are languages that are not mixed. Okay, so it depends on how you want to approach the subject matter. If after borrowing elements from another language, you think that your language is not mixed, I think there is something to be questioned. Because the elements that become part of the language you speak, they contribute to reshaping your language. And somehow we should probably be speaking of degrees of mixedness rather than in terms of mixed versus non-mixed languages. And in some cases, languages borrow less. In some cases, they don't. They borrow extensively. If you take English, the dominant global language now in the world, have you looked at the vocabulary of English, where all these terms come from? I bet more than 30% of the English vocabulary comes from other languages. And that the empire has contributed a lot to the vocabulary of English, you know, cocoa, banana, and all those terms. I think it's a way of life. It's the purists that are making our lives complicated by telling us you shouldn't use that. And people scorn the Académie Française for wanting purism. The funny part is that the Académie Française doesn't want to pay attention to how much English has borrowed from French and is obsessed by French borrowing from English. I don't think that there is anything, well, what is deserves a lot of attention, I think, is, for instance, the category of languages called intertwined languages. The particular way that, for instance, in Michif, part of the vocabulary comes from French, a large part of the vocabulary, but the morphosyntax comes from Cree, and the basic structure of the sentence is Cree, and there you find this. But why do you get this? Well, again, you have to bring in population structures. So, and in this particular case, you have the French that went natives and went and lived with the Cree. And because no particular power relation seems to have been part of this new population structure. So mutual influences were to be expected. And as an outsider, my speculation is that the French that went native, that probably couldn't get all that vocabulary, that indigenous vocabulary, brought in the vocabulary, but got enough of sense of the patterns for sentences and so forth that they played a very important role. But, you know, if the mixing is not just in terms of cohabitation, but also in terms of producing offspring that are of mixed ancestry, then people don't really care anymore about language boundaries and bring elements from the different languages together. And there is something that is happening now. Urban youth languages, they do something quite similar. So in Africa, the sentence pattern is a Bantu a sentence structure, but you look at the vocabulary, it's not necessarily African. It can come from English, it can come from French, depending on where you are. And the people that are doing this are not necessarily fluent speakers of European languages either. But they have developed a different kind of urban youth identity that operates in this kind of mixed system. So I'm sure that if you studied, if you do formal linguistics, how many terms have you borrowed from English in doing formal linguistics in Portuguese or in French, things like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks again for the really great talk.
Thank you. There's somebody here?
I would like to thank so much for your lecture, and I appreciate that the way do you represent the map of Africa, because normally the map of Africa represented very short than the normal way. And the question, I have two. One is, do you say that, what is the original people from Southern Africa? And the other question, how do you say the thing of Eurocentrism versus Afrocentrism? Thank you.
Okay. We have to be careful about both questions. So now people have more or less taken it for granted that the Khois and San people are the most indigenous people in Southern Africa. And of course, the Bantu people migrated there. But there's another side of the story that suggests that the Khoi and San people migrated to Southern Africa, probably from East Africa. Okay? Just a little bit sooner than the Bantu populations did. There's one version of the account. Then you want to ask, well, if South Africa is one of the cradles of humanity, who were living there before the Khoi and San arrived there? And I don't have any answer to that question. Okay, but in my Ecology of Language, the book, The Ecology of Language, I propose talking about indigeneity in terms of degrees of indigeneity. And if you take this from the point of view of colonization, yes, the Khoi and San preceded the Bantu populations, and the Bantu populations came and colonized to some extent the Bantu, yes, colonized the Khoi and San populations. And there was quite a bit of interbreeding that in a very biased way, where Bantu populations married Khoi and San women, but not the other way around. And that contributed to the endangerment of Khoi and San languages in the region. But then when the Europeans arrived, the Bantu are in a very good position to say, we are indigenous. Although if you are a Khoi or San, you can dispute it. But relative to the Europeans, they are indigenous. Okay, so these were the Boers. And the British came, and when you put things in perspective, the Afrikaners are to the Dutch what white Americans can say they are to Europeans. In other words, they are Africans, and they claim the term African so that they wouldn't be confused with other Europeans that came later than them. And when we speak of languages indigenous of Africa, I include Afrikaans among the indigenous languages of Africa, because Afrikaans was born in South Africa and not in Europe. And so these are things that we have to take into account. I think you can explain a lot of things better if you adopt the notion of degrees of indigeneity rather than speaking of indigenous people tout court. And you go to North Africa, you see the Arabs there, and there are populations that preceded the Arabs, because the Arabs arrived in North Africa in the 7th century, and soon after that they came to Iberia. And the Arabs colonized North Africa on the settlement model. And there are people we call Berbers and so forth that are more indigenous than the Arabs. But relative to Europeans that colonized North Africa, the French in particular, the Arabs can claim to be indigenous. So, how do we sort things out? What was the other question? Or did I answer it indirectly?
About Eurocentrism and
Eurocentrism. This is very delicate. Yes, history is written by the victor. And so a whole lot of the history of the world, which is problematic, has been written by Europeans. It would be nice if we also wrote the history of Europe from an outsider perspective. And that's what I'm trying to do. But especially if Africans wrote the history of Africa from their own perspective. It does not mean that because you are African, you are not Eurocentric. They are different things. Okay? It depends on to what extent you have emancipated yourself from European influence and sorted things out. Yeah. This is what, for instance, Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal was trying to do in his work. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna ask this very quick. I'm wondering if you ever explore the Jesuit, the Society of Jesus Missionary Archives, and their missionary linguistic work, and maybe, I don't know if it can bring on the table of discussion about this topic.
Yeah. We learn a lot of things through missionaries' diaries, and some missionaries became amateur anthropologists or amateur linguists. We learn quite a few things from them. But I think what I'm doing now is just an invitation to reopen the books on things. Please don't take my conjectures and hypotheses as the final word. As I said earlier, provocation, for instance, for Hugo, when I say I think that Creoles of South Asia really emerged after the Portuguese had left rather than when the Portuguese were still there. It's a viable alternative. It's like the Romance languages actually evolved after the Romans had left and not when the Romans were there. And so a number of things happened in the meantime. It does not mean that the people didn't speak Portuguese. They were speaking Portuguese while the Portuguese were there. But what happened after the Portuguese left? How much more latitude they had to diverge in a way that they wouldn't have done if the Portuguese had remained around.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Mufwene. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.